USC Shoah Foundation Center for Advanced Genocide Research. And it is my distinct pleasure to introduce you to Peg LeVine, our center fellow for this semester. Actually, the first or inaugural center fellow we have here. The center was established last year in April, so we kind of advancing to our first year anniversary. There is no better way to do this with having really interesting, innovative scholars here at our place. And it is a special pleasure because usually I'm introducing mostly historians who work on genocide or on the Holocaust, but here we have a scholar who is kind of a true polymath scholar. It's really something special. I try to give you an idea what she actually was doing in her academic career, which is really almost unimaginable. She started off with a Master of Psychology. That could be pretty normal, right? But then she got a doctor in education. And she didn't stop there. She ended up doing another doctor, this time in philosophy. But not in philosophy, she did it as a medical anthropologist. So we have here education, psychology, and medical anthropology kind of combined in one person, all these different approaches. And her work is really dedicated to the question of how people experience violence, if I can say this, what kind of impact this has on individuals, how this changes people's lives, and what we actually can do about it. And from these different areas like education, psychology, she is trying to find answers how to work and make also people's life better. So it's not only that she is a scholar who publishes, for example, oh no, it's not on here, she published the book in 2010, Love and Dread in Cambodia, Weddings, Birth, and Ritual Harm under the Khmer Rouge. But moreover than just publishing academic works, she did also a lot of practical work. So just to name a few kind of groups who, for whom she worked survivors of torture, human trafficked women and youth, children affected by landmine disasters, refugees and asylum seekers, and not at last, Khmer Rouge survivors. So if you see, these are very different groups, but they all have one in common, that they were experiencing heavily the impact of violence, sometimes individual violence, sometimes systematic violence, as in the case of the Cambodian genocide. So I really want to give a very warm welcome to Peg. Thank you all for coming, and I hope for a really enlightening talk and a good discussion afterwards.
Thank you. I've never been called a polymath before, so thank you for that, Wolf. Actually, all of my work really did start, I think, with Cambodia, because I've been in Australia for 23 years now. I mean, when I first started, when I was working on my first doctorate, it was when Cambodian and Vietnamese and Lao refugees were coming into the United States, and I was in Washington, D.C. then. There was a mental health center there. They were looking for someone to work with the refugee population, all thrown together as Indo-Chinese at that point in time. And they didn't know what to do with people because nobody knew the language. And for Cambodian people, there were no Cambodian physicians or psychiatrists to treat them, so Cambodians were being sent to Vietnamese psychiatrists who were treating them with pretty poor psychotropic medication without speaking the language. So that's actually where I began. But at that mental health center, they wanted to hire somebody to become a clay therapist to work with the Indo-Chinese group. And I knew clay, and I was a therapist. I wasn't a trained art therapist, and I put my hand up and I got the job. So that's sort of where it started with me, but then I went back to Cambodia after I migrated to Australia, but I'll I'll tell you that story later. I want to put my thank you slide up first, because when I end today, I want to end on a particular video clip, and I want you to just sit in that video clip before I open up discussion. So there's so many people. The list keeps growing as I stay here. I've only been here 2 months, and every day there's something kind that happens, and I think, oh, I want to add that person to the list. So this is just my list of people in my life here since I've come to LA, including David Chandler and Craig Etchison, who I've been in correspondence with in the last couple of days because of some things I bumped into in Long Beach that I'll talk about at the end. And Wolf Gruner and Stephen Smith in particular I want to thank. And George Weiss I don't think is here, but as a sculptor he's introduced me to alabaster, and so I'm so grateful to him for that. So there was a handout at the door with a Cambodian map. I can't really tell my story of what I've done that has led me to, this is the book I did. On the front cover is an umbilical cord that's wrapped in gauze. That's through a ceremony that I sat through in the Cardamom Mountains of a spirit medium. The umbilical cord is there, so for the next person who's giving birth, if the umbilical cord is wrapped around their neck and they survive, they could become the next spirit medium. So I just wanted to point that out before I get into my talk. So in order for me to talk about what I did, I don't want to make assumptions that you don't know, but I don't want to make assumptions that you do know much about the mapping and the history of the Khmer Rouge and how they came into power. So when I was preparing this, I thought, I felt like I was pulling off a Jules Verne film or something, Around the World in 80 Minutes, or a Journey to the Center of the Earth. So I'm going to do my best. The overview of my talk today, you'll notice already that I move around. I'm going to talk about Ritualcide, the definitions on the handout that I gave you. Preparing this talk really helped me solidify that. I'm trying to get that up onto Wikipedia. I'm going to talk about the ECCC, the Extraordinary Chambers of the Cambodian Courts, which is in session now as I speak, and I'll show you some material from that court. The Khmer Rouge progression of power, I'm going to flip through decades. Talk about how do you map as a researcher stories that keep changing. I had to create a new methodology for my research. That is why I went back and did a second PhD, Wolf, is because I actually wanted to make sure what I did was going to be bulletproof. And so in doing that, I knew I was going to invest the time. I was interested in the project anyway, so I grabbed a doctorate along the way because I was going to do that project. I'm going to talk about ritual and spirit infrastructure in Cambodia. If I were to conceive of a film of the next sequence of the killing fields, there would need to be animation in there. There would need to be material that really demonstrates the lived experience of the spirit phenomena in Cambodia and in people's lives. I'm talking about spirit-based. I will not be using the word spiritual today. I talk about spirit-based anxiety. In Cambodia, we talk about a person being susceptible. What is Angkar? I'm going to bring that into our talk, and then talk about trauma fallout and how the trauma in a spirit-based culture impacts imagination. And the question we'll have at the end for discussion, how is Ritualcide relevant to the Holocaust? So there is no word for resilience as we know it in the West in Khmer language. When unprotected from many things, one is susceptible. This is a quote from one of my respondents. I watched a soldier friend cut off a comrade's leg, but I saw Angkar in his eyes when he did it. Later he was my friend again. That was the day I became a kapok tree. And kapok is, the word has two meanings. One meaning is mute. So Ritualcide, my definition. It's taken me a while to get here. It's very wordy, but strategic prohibition, destruction, displacement, or alteration to the sequencing. Rituals and ceremonies have a particular sequencing that's important. You can probably think about this in your own life if you follow certain rituals. Or the symbolic meaning of ritual objects places mediators. In Cambodia we have spirit mediums and monks, and practices, including music and song, regardless of intent. Now, I put that term up there. I'm willing to talk about it later because there's a lot of debate in legal territory about when something happens with or without intent, it makes somebody more or less guilty, and I wanted to put that right up front. There was, most people know about Raphael Lemkin's coining of the word genocide, but he did introduce cultural genocide and offense by vandalism. Those two terms were not included in the 1948 Genocide Convention. And because I have worked with indigenous Khmer people in Cambodia, the '94 draft of the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People used the terms ethnocide and cultural genocide without definition, but the declaration dropped both the terms, so I just wanted to put that historical note there. And I will be talking, just weaving in and out, I'm not going to do a whole discussion on it, the ECCC. Set up in the courts, crimes under Cambodian law, murder, torture, religious persecution, and these are crimes under international law. Right now, in the Khmer Rouge trials, Doik was sentenced in 2009. Right now, we're with crimes against humanity. If you look in crimes against humanity, well, maybe it's not up there, but what's been included now are the Khmer Rouge weddings, which are considered forced. My work is controversial because I've not come to that conclusion. So these are the components of the courts. But I'm going to talk about this period, which has been officially termed the Democratic Kampuchea time, which has been used, these dates are used for the genocide trials, things that happened between the 17th of April 1975 and the 7th of January, Liberation Day 1979. The Khmer Rouge took 19 core provinces and put them into 6 zones. The map I gave you is the provinces. Up until the Khmer Rouge, there were a lot of people sort of coming and going in Cambodia, the French being one in particular with the French protectorate. And even though they initiated and made mandatory the use of French language and le voie lactée, the Milky Way, Cambodian people still held on to their cosmological perceptions. So the tracks of the white elephant were not removed from Cambodia even by the French. But the Khmer Rouge did tamper with the cosmology. So to do this fast and quick bit of history, the era of the 1950s is when the Khmer Rouge started building their power. I call it the Khmer Rouge brush mark. So Salasar, that's when Salasar aligns with outlawed Indo-Chinese communists after serving in '46 in the anti-French resistance under the Vietnam Ho Chi Minh. Salasar, who I will explain later, became Pol Pot when he occupied Phnom Penh, was part of the Marxist circle. These are the former Khmer Rouge leaders that were part of that Paris group. A book I recommend is Brother Number One, The Political Biography of Pol Pot. It's an excellent book, absolutely. It lets you into how Pol Pot believed what he believed was to the betterment of society. But these were his. Now, if we look at the crimes against humanity in the ECCC courts, we have 2 people right now being tried, and Ing Theris was just recently deemed to be unfit because of dementia. In fact, my colleague who's coming here in the next month, he is the psychiatrist that actually assessed and diagnosed her and gave testimony about that in the court. The 1960s, the movement's building. For those who are contemporaries of my group, because I was one of the Vietnam War protesters in the late 60s, some of this history might resonate a little bit. So we have the Communist Party leaders in 1963 sort of just really pulling things together. SAR renames his party the Communist Party of Kampuchea, informally known as CPK. It's when Lon Nol became premier of the country. And it's also when, this is an important note, when the International Covenant of Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights came into being, the right to participate in cultural life, which I think Ritualcide has some impact with, and freedom from fear. But the turning point really was when the US started pursuing Vietnam forces within the Cambodian borders. It was just right for the Khmer Rouge to use that as material to convince people that the Khmer Rouge were out to protect the Cambodians from those forces that were infiltrating. Lon Nol became prime minister, and many more things were happening. A lot of people in my study talked about the Lon Nol's collateral ruin in the rural villages and how they had to move into Phnom Penh before the evacuation happened. But the other thing that was happening was that the US was just bombing the hell out of that eastern side of the country at that time. So I call 1970 the year the shit hits the fan, because many things happened. There was a coup d'etat and Sihanouk was ousted. One of the biggest things that happened really to give the Khmer Rouge just that platform they needed was that President Richard Nixon announced the US invasion into Cambodia, and that's when American troops invaded with the South Vietnamese People's Army. We have Kent State. People would have heard about Kent State. That happened in Ohio on May 4th, where students demonstrated and were killed. For those who are in law, studying law, who might be in the audience, the Cooper Church Amendment, I recommend, is fascinating to read, and how, okay, Richard Nixon was called Tricky Dick, but what he did with that and how he really did trick people into thinking that that amendment was moving forward. So Nixon sanctioned the training of Lon Nol soldiers in Laos as well as a way of getting around the Cooper Church Amendment. But as a way of just honoring this period and sort of bringing it as a crescendo of it being the real change time, I just want to play one song from that period that was banned from the US radios for a while. So Student War Protesters, and that was Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young, the lyrics written by Neil Young. So 1971, after that period, is when things got really tricky and when people started to feel very tricked. 71 to 73 is a time when spirit protection within Cambodia started narrowing. Now, Cambodia is Theravada Buddhist, but also animist as well. And the Khmer Rouge were really targeting the rural animist regions early on before they took into cities. Ritual objects were being targeted. Certainly monks were being targeted by the Khmer Rouge. And Krati was being infiltrated with the Khmer Rouge, and evacuations started to begin in that region. In 1972, we don't hear about this like we hear about Kent State. But in 1972, Cambodian soldiers came in to Phnom Penh, and 3 student demonstrators were murdered. So we don't hear about that. It'd be nice to have a song about that. 1972, Hun Sen, who now is the Khmer, he did change his name. He was born Hun Banal. He changed his name and he joined the Khmer Rouge. Now there's a lot of controversy about that because he's the prime minister today. He's been in power for 30 years, longest person in power in the history of Asia. But he, like other students who were demonstrating against the Lon Nol, were led to believe that the Khmer Rouge was actually going to be sort of the next sort of republic change for the country. So again, he joined the Khmer Rouge. When I was working on my project, because before I began my research, I had the privilege, I had two positions in Cambodia. One is that I was on the faculty of psychology at the Royal University of Phnom Penh, and I was assisting their development of their Buddhist psychology program. And so I had links to the faculty there when I was thinking about this project. And the other link I had was that I was working at Chumni's Hospital, which was the first psychiatric hospital that the Khmer used as a hospital during the Khmer Rouge period. And I was working there, working with children of trauma, really, many different types of trauma, physical and psychological. And so the staff there became interested in my project. And what I'm showing you now is a clip from a nurse who was on the staff. When I was telling her that I was interested in getting information about the weddings, were they forced or not, she said, "Oh, Peg, we could talk to my uncle." So this is just at the center where I was working, and I'm speaking to her uncle about his experience during the Khmer Rouge. This particular piece is about his beginning when he was taken in by the Khmer Rouge as a soldier.
So it seems that during 1973, Siam district also it's become a Khmer Rouge. It become a Khmer Rouge. So whenever they need the man from the village, they have to come to fight with the Lon.
So they, in some ways, drafted them into the Khmer Rouge.
Yes.
Already
Khmer Rouge started.
Even if they were educated, did it matter? Did it matter that he was educated at that time?
As an army, they don't allow to hold the gun yet, and also not trained to be hold a gun yet.
So his job was that he ran guns across the border. And he and his wife were married under the Khmer Rouge in a group wedding and are still together. 1973 is when the Khmer Rouge purges began, which was the year that he was first drafted into the Khmer Rouge. Buddhist monks were derobed, Watson temples were emptied, Muslim chams were not to practice. Those who were formally educated, Lon Nol and government associates were targeted for murder, targeted to be killed or to be imprisoned. Personal possessions, so we're starting to move to a communist state. Personal possessions were not allowed. Religion, art, photos, papers, medicine, private means of transport were banned or destroyed, and land holdings were starting to be cut into a uniform side. So this is the era when I started to see Ritualcide taking hold, and this is the year when collective weddings were arranged by Angkar. I believe this is a propaganda picture. That's just my belief. This is a picture from the archives of DC Cam. They have 3 photographs of the weddings. But you can see during Khmer time, everybody was wearing black. Women had to cut their hair. Here, the reason I think it's propaganda is because a lot of people didn't have sandals. There's a lot of things in this picture that are too perfect for the descriptions I have, even as early as 1973. The Khmer Rouge is sanctioned globally in 1974 by 63 countries as the official Cambodian government. And then we have the big day, April 17th, 1975, when the evacuation of Phnom Penh happens. After the occupation, that's when Solid Tsar takes the name Pol Pot. Pol Pot stands for Politique Potentielle. So he took the first 3 letters of both those words. And that regime lasted, I'm not going to go into all the things that happened in the middle now, I'm just wanting to give you the history to lead you up. That regime lasted until January 1979. Noticing again, I've just given you some things that were happening before 1975, and there's a lot that happened after 1979, but the trials are only staying within that period of time. So January 7th, 1979 is what's called Liberation Day. If you work at the Royal University of Phnom Penh, I'd say 40% of the students have that as their birthday, okay? So on their papers. So there's a lot that you can read on this period. There's a lot of discussion papers out there by historians and people in political science about was it a liberation, was it an invasion? I sort of see it as a liberation by invasion. But the new administration was formed from ex-Khmer Rouge fighters that are now there in Phnom Penh. And to make you just have a sense of what it was like for someone in this country in particular to be a refugee, and I say this having now moved to Australia and having worked with Cambodian refugees in Australia, where one Cambodian former refugee said to me, "We could have gone to America, but came to Australia because Angkar is the trickster in that land." Okay, so we have a United Nations flag. We have a United Nations stamp, 25-cent stamp, 1989, with Democratic Kampuchea on it. And we have the coat of arms, Democratic Kampuchea, with the democratic flag flying in New York into the 1990s. We have 1979 to 1982, Khmer Rouge had Cambodia's UN seat as Democratic Kampuchea, and so they didn't lose that seat. They changed the name, a name that didn't exist in Cambodia, by the way, to the Coalition Government of Democratic Kampuchea, and had a seat in the United Nations till 1994. So just imagine what it was like to come here to seek refuge and to have the impact of this in your life. So I want to talk about Forêt des Morts, because in Cambodia there's something called the Forest of the Dead, where spirits swarm. So I want to move into sort of more spirit phenomena manifest material. In Cambodia, spirits manifest spontaneously. This is very important for people who are left inside Cambodia. Mad spirits jump out of those who die violently. It could be murder, it could be landmine accident, it could be a number of different things. But if somebody dies a violent death, they sometimes are buried in the Forest of the Dead. It's a burial place located usually 1 or 2 kilometers away from the village. Sites are never towards the east of the village. Even my Cambodian friends tell me, even if I go to a hotel room and the bed is faced to the west, to sleep on the other end of the bed and faced east. Very important to place the head east or to place the place east. But those corpses don't have the right to be cremated. This is what was striking for me when I was doing my research, because I did a lot of research with women who gave birth. Women who die while giving birth or stillborn babies can cause bad fate to those residing in the areas, and they sometimes, depending on how they die, are buried in the Forest of the Dead. So this string that I have on my wrist, it's kind of almost worn out, this string holds my souls in me so that if something happens to me, my spirit doesn't jump out and cause harms to others. This is an incredible researcher, Ang Chulong, for those of you who are interested in any of this material. So I just want to give you a sense of what it's like to be in Cambodia with the fallout from Democratic Kampuchea, because I'm going to leave that buildup behind. And this is the site on the day that I decided to do my research. I went here with my Cambodian friends who didn't actually, I took a PhD student here actually with my colleagues, and my colleagues didn't want to walk on this land. So I had been talking to who you're going to see soon in some film clips, about his wedding story, and he changed his story when we were here at this site, at this mass grave of 86 graves and 8,985 bodies on this site. And he said to me, Peg, when we're unsure of Ankar, he was very quiet. I said, you're very quiet. And he says, when we're unsure of Ankar, we say nothing. We change our past, we think nothing. There's Alfred Adler made a statement, a lie would have no sense unless the truth were felt as dangerous. And there's a Buddhist phrase, reality sets under the lie. I spoke to about his wedding story a couple of times before we went to this site, and his wedding story was always idyllic. But then this day, he talked about it so very differently. And so then I asked if he could be my sort of sample subject to begin my research, and he agreed to that. So in his first account, he said he was married under Ankar. I'll talk about Ankar in a bit, but not forced. At Royal University of Phnom Penh, one day we were doing some planning in our Buddhist psychology department, and he told me a story, his first story. Then we had a faculty lunch right before the coup, actually, in 1997. And he told me a story that was similar but not the same. But the day that we were on that killing field site, he told a very different story. And so I asked him if I could travel with him and his wife back to their work camps, to their wedding site, and to the place where Teal gave birth. How, what, where changed in his stories, but his interpretation about his wedding being forced never changed. I was interested in that because the literature said that the weddings were forced, and I believed it until I did my research. So then I had to set up a research study, and for students here, I wanted to put this slide up because it took me a while to figure out how do I overlap almost Venn diagram style. Most of our research that we do, even when we take testimonial, we may get context research and content research, but we don't get a lot of process research. So I wanted to do research where I could hold the content and the context and the process and almost do a regression analysis on all of those three fields. So the context of where, when, and with whom things happen, I used film ethnography for that. I was interested in proxemics, how people place themselves to each other, and so on and so forth, and you can see that in film. I was interested in spirit proxemics, and I realized I wasn't going to be able to get spirit material unless I filmed people actually having an experience of being in the presence of spirits. So that's what I set out to do with my film work. And with the process material, I kept my own heuristic field diaries, and I started sculpting. The material was becoming overwhelming for me, and so I made representational sculptures, and I'll talk about those as well. I was interested in research methodologies for indigenous people, and there's because I began my study in New Zealand, there's a wonderful Maori woman who has written a book, Decolonizing Methodologies, Research in Indigenous Peoples, a book that I recommend. But I had a duty of care when I traveled with people. The more I started to get a sense of the spirit material that was there, the more I realized I had a duty of care to the people I was traveling with. My field research covered 10 years, and this is my map, all the places and all the people that I traveled with, getting data about rituals before the Khmer Rouge, during the Khmer Rouge, and after the Khmer Rouge in different villages, and also getting history on the weddings and births during the Khmer Rouge. So I had 22 purposes of sample and a random sample of 170. And then I had a ritual sample of 1,002 people in my study. You can see the Khmer Rouge weren't very active in the Northwest. I really only had one sample village in the Northwest that I went to. And a lot of my patterns actually followed the patterns of the Khmer Rouge. So I was able to map when things happened first and so on. I wanted to do a time-place map. The other thing I did in my research, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but I read, because I can read French, my speaking is atrocious, but at least I can read it. So I was able to go back into some of the anthropologists and cartographers and read about ritual dynamics from the turn of the last century, and certainly reading and having discussions with the Theravada animist scholars in Southeast Asia. Read the Gadalogs, which is a very interesting book, moral book. And then I reviewed unstructured methods of interviews, and of course David Boder kept popping out to me. Mostly I was interested in Boder's work because he used a free association method, little eye contact, He invited singing in first language, but he was the first person in because I was looking for ritual and sort of like threads to Ritualcide. Boder was the first person who talked about the loss of the familiar. And he recorded that, the loss of books, the loss of objects, the loss of religious practices, the loss of the sound of one's own voice. Realized the kapok tree, mute, where people were mute during the Khmer Rouge, was not even, the voice didn't even sound familiar anymore. And the other thing that Boder struck me with was that he was able to capture on his tapes peculiar verbal structures. So I was interested in that as process material. He had an elite class of violence analyzed. My violent elite were other. Angkar comes in, and I'll talk about that. So Am and Teal were married in 1977 with 32 other couples in Kampong Speu. Before we traveled together, as a sort of duty of care, before our travel, we went to a ceremony to strengthen souls, or people call back souls, but we were to strengthen our souls. We got white thread tied to our wrist in a sequenced ceremony. Sometimes when people travel, they do that. It assists a safe journey. So that was helpful for us to do the night before we traveled. So this is Am and Teal traveling to a place they hadn't been since the liberation. I don't know if this sounds, can you hear that? It'll come up a little bit, it's okay. Traditional Khmer music that people couldn't listen to during the Khmer Rouge, music being so essential for most ceremonies. So he's telling me about what this field was to him as a young boy. They were water killing fields where the boys that were in his work camp were taken.
Yes, this is the place where I got married. So I would like to tell a bit about
It's Khmer Rouge headquarters.
organizing for to get married here.
There was a prison below the building, and they were married on top of the building. And he said it was a happy, sad time for him because he was being married, which meant he was going to live, but the people below him, who he could see through the cracks in the floor, were not going to live. So every time I went to a village and traveled with someone, I started, whether you want to call it snowballing, there's no snow in, I sometimes say dung balling, there's no snow in Cambodia. I would see who else was married in that place. And we'd often sit and they would tell me their story. And oftentimes they were married by a different leader, so I could see how the leader was actually creating new rituals or not. Notice how women touch. They'd never met each other before, but it's important for what I'm going to say next.
Yes, they married after me. Yes, after me 1 year. Yeah.
And how many couples were married with them?
Yeah.មានប្រមាណអ្នកតែកើតមកបងរៀបមើល3ទេតិចណា Oh,
3 នាក់រៀបហ៎
there were only 8 couple. This is family. Yes.
3 គូបង3គូ
Yes, 8 couple.
Did they know each other before they got married or only on the day? Like,
ហើយការរៀបការស្គាល់ពីតានេះមុនណាមុនការណា Oh, maybe not.
I was interested in what kept them together. So I met so many couples who are still together, especially on that site. I think I met 12 couples that were still together and had children there and were living in that village that they were placed in under the Khmer Rouge. So my picture went out. So I'll just move to the next slide. Am and Teal said the Buddha protects us and keeps us together, but the term they used was Kupreen. Our marriage was arranged before we were born. So this is an interview with Dr. Lena, who's coming here next month. And and I'll let that, where we're talking about these concepts of Kuprin and Kupkam.
I have one more question because it's getting so late. Your brother-in-law said that he thought your sister maybe was from another life marriage.
No, sounds like I just asked about it. I just explained to you about it called Kuprin. Kuprin means it sounds like the couple can live together until the rest of their life. It's Kuprin. In Buddhism, people believe that this is a range offered by the Buddha. You know, it's a difficult to shoot together and.
So Buddha arranged
it's something.
somehow.
Yes.
And does your sister believe that too?
No, I chưa đánh cung kính cô ấy chưa rồi. Yeah.
លោកជាមួយគ្នាយើងមិនដែលឆ្លោះគ្នាមកទោះឥឡូវយើងនៅស្រឡាញ់គ្នាដែរពីព្រោះយើងមានអធិស្ឋានជាមួយគ្នាហើយដល់ពេលនេះយើងមិននឹកឃើញបងអាពាហ៍ពាហ៍ព្រោះយើងស្រឡាញ់គ្នាដូចថាចិត្តមួយឆ្លាមមួយទៅហើយយើងអត់មានអីដូចហើយយើងមិនដែលឆ្លោះគ្នាសោះតាំងពីកាលមកទៅទោះបីអត់ស៊ីយើងមិនឃើញយើងដែរ
I think it's something like we do a retrospective research analysis. Because there are two types of marriage, or two types of couple. We call Kupren or Kukam. Kuku means couple. Pren means like something. Pren means like in the past. You know, it means that the couple offered or designed to meet each other from the past is a good one because people can live together forever.
So when you say past, is it past before they were born?
Before they were born. Now, Kupren means pren means mau there. Yes, I just speak the word in order to explain to you the meaning why it's called Kupren. And Kupkam means sin. Couple with sin, with having sin. You know, sin in karma. Karma means sin. So when they talk about Kupkam, it means that the couple won't stay together until the rest of the life. Means they will break up at some point in time.
So the people that now are at the ECCC who are giving testimony about the forced weddings, the civil party members, are creating a lot of shame in people that were married under the Khmer Rouge, who claim that their weddings were real weddings that the Buddha arranged before they were born. And some are now afraid to tell their children that they were married at that time. So it's a very sensitive story right now in the media even. So this is Teal. I just wanted to bring this forward.
There are only 4 girls. There were only 4 girls in this.
This is at her work site. She was in a pagoda.
Yes, and no body there. Yes, besides of the 4 girls.
No soldiers?
No soldiers. No soldiers. Yes.
No monks?
No monks. Oh, no monks. In proper time, no monks everywhere. Every pagoda. Yes. Yeah. So that my wife, this will have one cottage and also to feed the chicken and pig. And over there, she slept. She slept in the stupa. We go to see her. In the stupa. Yes.
So she slept in the stupa, which is there.
Are afraid of stupa. Yes. But that time, live and sleep in the stupa. Very changed.
Afraid of the stupa because of the bones.
Yes, because the bone. Yes.
So I just want to make a comment there. So that was the stupa. She was locked up in there with other girls every night. It was dark in there. And Teal said to me she was more afraid of being locked up with the spirits of the bones than she was of what the Khmer Rouge could have done to her. So just to give you a sense of that. So this is a scene, but I'm not going to show it because I want to move along, where Teal talks about how the Khmer Rouge told her to walk probably about 3 hours to go to the headquarters that you saw where she married She was given a krama, a scarf, and she knew by then, in 1977, if she was given a krama, it meant that she was going to get married. It didn't mean that she was going to get killed. So what started to happen was the Khmer Rouge started planning the group weddings and would take the leaders of the boys and girls camps would meet and they would determine who was a good couple. Did they come from the same area? And they would arrange their marriages, and then they would give out scarves to the people they thought were good couples. If they didn't find people with good couples, then, well, they were sent to be killed. So the krama actually, as an object, everyday object, people use the krama for so many things. They put it on their head to carry things, they wash things with it, has so many wonderful meanings. All of a sudden, the meaning of the krama during the Khmer Rouge took on a different meaning. It meant that you were going to live, but it also meant that people you loved might die. So the wedding, the Khmer Rouge warped the meaning of krama. So one man said to me, that day I got a krama, my friend did not. We spoke nothing. Our fate was tied to cloth. Even today when I touch my krama, I see him. We were in primary school together. He was my best friend. So again, this machine started to build and rituals were being mutated along the way. Khmer Rouge used revolutionary lyrics during the weddings. So traditionally, music is played at weddings at different times of the day. Traditionally, weddings go for 3 days in Cambodia. The music determines when people in the fields will come back to certain events, but also there's certain music that's played for the ancestors to be invited to the ceremony. Nekta, Teal spoke of Nekta, which is a spirit tree. The day the Khmer Rouge soldiers chopped down the Nekta, we knew bad things would happen soon after. So I'm just going to play this. I played it at the conference in November just because I think it says where the biography of the researcher comes in research. Up until this point, I was doing my research on the Khmer Rouge weddings. This one day I went out with Teal and on yet another travel trip, and we stopped at a roadside and I had eggs that just did not sit well with me. Noted every time we went somewhere she would see what trees were there in different places. So I got sick through the day, but this is Teal. There was one village I was in and 5 women came and rubbed me like this. They took my shirt off and they put special oils on me. And this was the moment where I was just riding along with the wedding stories. In this moment after this episode, I looked up at Teal and I said, Teal, when you gave birth during the Khmer Rouge, did women attend to you the way women are attending to me? And she said, oh no, we went by ourselves, no one touched us. And then it literally hit me that nobody touched her when she gave birth. Now she did tell me that she made certain symbols in the ground that people make to protect them. She told me that she didn't get to have what's called roasting after her birth, a very susceptible time, not only for the mother, but the baby. The fontanelle, a spirit, can actually enter the head of a fontanelle if the baby doesn't have a special salve on the top of their head. So she talked to me about how frightened she was after her birth. She also talked to me about the wedding, after the weddings, how the Khmer Rouge were building these little huts and putting people who just got married in these huts to procreate, and how the soldiers would watch them outside the hut to make sure that they were going to have sex so that they could have babies, so that they could start creating the new communes. So the weddings and then the births were part of the communal machine that was happening during the Khmer Rouge. This is the first hut activity I got, a photograph of of one of the huts that was shown to me. Most people spoke about time. I didn't want to take exact time of ages. People spoke in terms of seasons. That's what they remembered the most. If you pressed them, they would make something up. But they would say in the harvest of 77, that's when that happened, because they didn't know what time it was. So I was moved by Teal's story, and that was this is a piece I took to bronze. I'll move the other piece forward. It's a bit out of order. But when Teal told me her story, I didn't go out of the house where I was staying, and I had a bag of clay, and I created, this is wet, and I knew it wasn't going to make it back to Australia to fire, so I didn't fire it. I sort of carried it gently back. I made a mold of it, and then I took it to bronze. But the story that she told me was after she took me to her birthing site. She said, "Peg, I'll take you to where I gave birth." And then she told me about the medical experiments that were being done on women during the Khmer Rouge time. And so again, that you get a krama, it means you're living, but somebody else isn't. You know, you're waiting in this place to give birth. By this time, they had little birth units where women were giving birth because there was enough rice that women were menstruating. So you watch somebody else die, but what do you do with that? We may think from our Western perspective that the horror in that is witnessing that murder of that woman and that baby, but the horror comes in the spirits that were violently killed will roam and can harm villagers and rave havoc for the rest of your life in a certain region. So the spirit-based material, I mean, again, Teal said that she was afraid of the mother's spirit after that. That was more horrifying for her in some ways than what she witnessed. So again, susceptible to harm. After she told me that and I went to the site where she was, we went and she had a water ceremony. Again, the duty of care to the people I was traveling with. I mean, because I was taking people to sites where things happened to them, horrible things happened to them. And so now in Cambodia, people have access to these rituals, which are important. Questions I asked: what protected you? What protects you? This is a rank ordered of what protects people: ancestors, the Buddha, luck, fortune, turn is mother's milk, amulets, tattoos, Tranen are little teeny fairies. They have beautiful little water areas for fairies. And people actually secretly sought Kru Khmer, spirit mediums and fortune tellers, even though the Khmer Rouge had derobed monks. What they didn't do, which is what Papa Doc did, if people know the regime in Haiti with Papa Doc went after rituals and ritual mediums. The Khmer Rouge didn't do that. I tend to think if they did, they may have actually pulled off the regime. The less people had access to rituals during the Khmer Rouge, the more frightened they became. But people still would sneak off to villages after they got married. They would seek a fortune teller to see if the day was a good day for them. Today, survivors of the Khmer Rouge soothe ancestors by going to spirit mediums. This is a medium. I'm sort of finishing a study with a colleague of mine, Didier Bertrand, and also a Cambodian colleague of mine in the Cardamom Mountains. This spirit medium actually is a Khmer Rouge survivor as well, as most of the mediums are. Looking at how the medium trance and ancestors' communication through a medium's body and voice, what impact that has on a community. So he's in a receptive trance. One woman said in my transcripts, "I come to this medium on Buddhist days to help my father rest. I tried to push his head to the west when I left him floating with other bodies in the river. I tried my best. I was only 12 years old." So on this particular day, she was able to speak to her father through the medium. So I just have a couple more slides here. This is Lena, just to bring in the susceptibility of Angkar. This is back in, I wanted to sort of use the same scene so you're familiar with people.
She experienced Khmer Rouge regime again. Khmer will come back and rule the regime again. So she experienced the same thing. Yes. And then she thought, she just blamed herself because at that time after the liberation, after consent came to.
So his sister-in-law blames herself for not taking their children to the refugee camps because she's afraid that Angkar and the Khmer Rouge will come back to Cambodia.
To the camp in order to escape abroad. The Thai border camp, and she regret that and blame and said that she didn't go. That's why she re-experienced Khmer Rouge.
So in the dream, she regrets that.
Yeah, regret that.
But in real life, does she regret?
Feel regret that they didn't go to another country because they are afraid of the Khmer Rouge regime.
So a lot of people are afraid the Khmer Rouge regime will come back. Angkar, I've been floating that word around. Angkar literally means, and people use it in every historian uses the word Angkar to equal organization. But because I was going after spirit material, I started to unleash what Angkar really meant to people. And these are some of the more prevalent explanations when I would say to people, what is Angkar? Because of the way they described, I got the process and how they spoke about Angkar, and I got to see on film their bodies when they were describing Angkar. 72% of my respondents, of 1,002 respondents, believe that Angkar will return again. So that makes the Khmer Rouge Tribunal quite frightening too. A thing that hears what you think, do not think. So people really believed that their thoughts were not their own, that Angkar could hear anything they thought. So when and Teal were walking, they were allowed to actually go to their mother's house after they got married for 3 days and 3 nights, which is a tradition. The Khmer Rouge let them do that. And I said to as we were driving to her mother's house, do you remember what you talked about when you traveled together, walked together all night to go to Teal's mother's? And he said, no, we didn't talk, but because we couldn't think, because Angkar would hear what we thought. So if we tried to escape, Angkar would know that before that would happen. So I think it's important that I bring that home. A lot of people described Angkar as a claws that hides in the trees, crazy apsara that grows claws, a thing that becomes another thing that makes you crazy and makes you do crazy things you want to forget but can never forget. So Angkar was something very transforming. So this creature here that I created, I tried, I'm working on more though, I have to say. I wanted to create something in bronze that actually, if you were here, that cast a shadow. A lot of people told me that when they see shadows, they're not sure whether it's Angkar or not. So I'm trying to kind of do some representational piece. Malinowski said, a Polish anthropologist said, myths legitimate social structures. So you use Angkar, which was very amorphous. Nobody knew where the Khmer Rouge headquarters were. People believed over time in this animist Theravadist sort of cultural context that Angkar could be a possessing force. So myths legitimate social structures. It gave the Khmer Rouge more power, I'm claiming. Myths get put into social circulation, which it did. Myths evoke mystery and can consume imaginations, which is what I think trauma fallout is. So I want to show you my last Cambodian slide on what I consider to be trauma fallout.
And do you sometimes have dreams about this?
Dream about what?
Night dreams in the night.
But now?
Yeah.
Cho lại mà như này sắp khơi họ khơi những ta bài mà thôi. Rồi sắp có bạn mình phi nhận cái các bạn ấy. Yes, nightmare. Get up and tức là lấy sắp khơi lấy oxygen này.
Sắp khơi nhá. Tại vì một con đôi thằng con hiểu sắp nhá. Nhưng một tô một ai nha.
ការងារលំបាកគឺការងារដែលធ្ងន់ខ្ពស់ហើយដែលយើងមិនជឿថាយើងធ្វើបានគេខំទៅធ្វើគឺទីមួយប្រអប់មិនឲ្យយើងស៊ីមិនឲ្យស៊ីស្អែកហើយយើងខ្លួនយើងអត់មានសាច់ឈាមទេ
He's describing a starving body.
ធំជាងគាត់ដែរគាត់អាចទៅប៉ុណ្្នឹងហើយជឿគឺដើរតែពាក់តែនឹងគឺគាត់ដឹងដែរ
So So now you're going to see part of this tape.
No worry about children. Because when
Lena is a psychiatrist, and I had him go back the next day because I was so concerned about Mr. T. You can see he's in a dissociative, almost trance state. Again, the duty of care with anybody that I worked with. His wife is moving, but he's just there. It goes on. It goes on. So the next day, Lena went back. He went back a number of days. And he then had a ceremony. He went and got an amulet from a monk. But he called the Khmer Rouge the body robbers. Angkor turned my body into a bony gecko. This is a piece of black clay that I represented that with. Another woman, touching one's own body became taboo. Severed from the beautiful, women didn't experience anything sensual about their bodies. They didn't even want to touch their own bodies. This sculpture is over there. When my sister died, my arm fell off. She died before the ugly set in. I went on sleeping without her, with the foul smell of my body that was not mine, with a head that had no place to sit. So again, the body, and I think that we haven't really represented people's experiences of body in some of the Holocaust literature. This is a Long Beach Wat. I was going to tell a story about that, but if people wanted me to tell that later, I will, about some things that are happening now in Long Beach that in some ways represent some of the material I've been speaking about. The definition of ritualcide, again, I want to say it one more time and then show you one clip of a Holocaust survivor here from the archives. Ritualcide is the strategic prohibition, destruction, displacement, or alteration to sequencing or symbolic meaning of the ritual objects, places, practices, mediators, and music or lyrics, regardless of intent. So my question, I'm going to show you two short clips from the archives here at the Shoah Foundation, and then my question for those of you who want to stay that I'd love to open up as a discussion is, how is ritualcide relevant to the Holocaust? This person happens, I didn't plan it this way, but this person is from Melbourne in Caulfield, near where I used to live, so it's exciting when I realized the place.
We stood up the other day, Rosh Hashanah, in the toilet, the bench of each block was a toilet. The washrooms in the bench, each block. They went out and we done Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And we could.
Did you have a prayer book?
Without prayer book. People remembered prayer books were plenty there. They brought it from all of Poland and Hungary, all Europe.
Did you have access to them though?
Well, Canada was there, plenty. It's spoken to the camp, but still you didn't need it. People who remembered by heart, whatever you could.
So in the
There was a shofar. Rosh Hashanah. People knew a shofar.
Where did the shofar come from?
There was plenty of shofars. You could have thousands of shofars there.
Wasn't there a danger of being...
They smuggled to Canada, could we bring it in? Smuggle it in. Everything is smuggled.
Wasn't there a danger of if you played it, it would be...
Well, I mean, we've done it. I mean, when we know people sending this side, the other side, no necessity.
So in the middle of Auschwitz,
In the
you blew the shofar and you dubbed it.
in the washroom in the back, this barrack.
And this last slide.
The block inside, we used to have groups, we sang together, we sit down on the bank and singing, stories, singing Yiddish songs, Polish songs, any song.
Do you remember any of them?
To remember, a lot of Yiddish songs, I remember Yiddish songs. Lullabies, Yiddish lullabies, other songs, Hebrew songs.
Would you like to sing any for me now?
Was I will sing a song of Privici, brennt a fire, and die Stief ist heiß, sitzt der Rebelle, mit kleine Kinderle, lernt alle bei. Lernt Kinderle, mit Reus Heishi, lernt alle bei. Wer es besser lernen, Visit Messagena, never come to fool. Visit Messagena, never come to fool.
What's that about?
Children, go to kind of beginning. If you learn good, if you learn other base, you become a present. If you learn better, you become men with learning.
How important was that part of your camp life? That
Upbringing.
that social part at night when you'd sing. How important to you was that?
Whenever we had not the guts itself, and nobody was there, no accessorate or any selection, you could sit down on the part, the middle of the brick or the organ, a group, with each one sang a song, but I remember many songs. Each one was singing a song.
Do you think they helped you? That singing?
Oh, health gives us so respect. You are somebody. You still didn't forget yourself. You're still retaining the Yiddishkeit. You will, after all, you will succeed. You will come out. This is the whole. It's a whole. Whole.
Thank you, Greg, for helping me with that. So, open for discussion if people want to. Make comments. Yes.
I had a question about what are the traditional marriage practices prior to Khmer Rouge's?
Very good question. Yep.
Forced marriages. Like how did people meet and get married?
Usually arranged. Yeah, almost everyone that was a parent of those who were married under the Khmer Rouge had arranged marriages. Even there's one colleague of mine at the university who just arranged about a year ago the marriage of her daughter, but it didn't really work out because the person she arranged her to didn't want, the young man didn't want her daughter to actually talk to other university students, so that didn't work out, but it was arranged. So yeah, most of them were arranged. Most of the practices or the rituals had a sequence as to how marriage happened. Yes, people stayed in their parents' home for 3 days, and oftentimes parents would listen to see if the couple was having sex in the room that they were given. So they were surveilled a little bit, but it had a whole different meaning to it than being watched by the soldiers, of course. But a lot of the rituals were followed during the Khmer Rouge period.
And is that what kind of complicates the issue of some of these people who were in a forced marriage, who really don't see themselves as being in a forced marriage and are still together now?
Well, the forced marriages are based on the civil party members that have come forward, about 42 members, but I have a sample of 1,002 that claims their wedding weren't married. So it's just a really, I could have gone in a lot of different directions. I think there's a lot of morality in here. I think there's a lot of I read Bram Stoker's book, Dracula, when I was working on this book, thinking this through in terms of the morality. And I think in the West we have views about love, that if you are told to marry someone and you don't love that person, then it's forced. If you're told to marry somebody and you love that person, then it's not forced. I think and also passion is in there. There are some taboos. To have passion with love is one thing, but to have passion without love is another thing. So, I think there's a lot of Western overlay that's been put on that. Actually, Elizabeth Becker just gave testimony. The transcripts are there for you to go on to the ECCC. You can put in English, you can look at the transcripts, you can watch the videos. She just gave testimony. She was one of the first historians that just in a cavalier line in one of her books said forced weddings. So I haven't read all of her transcripts yet. I'm in the process of going through them to see what she was asked about that throwaway line. But as far as I know, still I'm the only researcher that has done that's why I went out to do this other doctorate, has done a reliable and valid study on this topic. Yeah. So good question. Yes, Nancy.
Thank you for what you do. You're fascinating talk.
Thank you.
There are many, many questions I have, but the one immediate one has to do with Angkar.
Right.
And it's sort of a point of information. I know, for instance, that there's Angkar Wat.
Encore.
So,
Yeah.
okay,
ANKOR. Yes, very different. Yep.
So,
And the script is different. Yep.
my question that still is, was there a concept before the Khmer Rouge of Angkar, and what was it? And then if it did exist prior to the Khmer Rouge, how does it get linked to the Khmer Rouge? And
Right.
Because if you say that Angkar is going to come back, is that the same thing as saying that the Khmer Rouge is going to come back?
It's a little bit. It's a little bit more mythical than that, than saying the Khmer Rouge, and maybe I can demonstrate this by actually giving you that clip from Long Beach. There's a temple in Long Beach that I was very interested in researching before I even came to the US, because if people know Hang Noor was the actor in The Killing Fields who was murdered in LA. So there's a temple that he co-founded, and there's been a lot of controversy about that temple being taken over. The article that I read from 2009 LA Times said that a Texan evangelist was going into that temple, but when I actually went to the temple just within the past month, what I discovered, and I have no reason to believe this isn't true based on some other research I've been doing, and with Craig Etchison as well, who's now at George Mason University in the Washington, D.C. area, is that I went to this temple just to get the story, and these women started telling me the story, and then they got very, very animated and very, very upset, and one thing led to another. I'm not going to go into those details, but in the end, I was told that a former Khmer Rouge has portrayed himself as a monk and is now taking over the temple with another person who's come in from Kansas. And so they're holding the temple now and have gotten the deed to the temple. But the thing that was so powerful for me was when I walked out with these women, as the police arrived, by the way, because I was told to leave with a colleague of mine. When I was walking out with these women and the police arrived and the police checked that, yes, I was invited into the temple by these women, as I was getting in a car and the women were getting in a car, a woman grabbed my arm and she looked at me and she said, you know, Angkar is here. And I looked in her eyes and I thought, so yeah, it's different than, when she said that, it was different than the Khmer Rouge, because she was talking about the Khmer Rouge soldier who has taken over the temple. This is not so unusual in the United States right now. It's happening in other places apparently, according to a colleague of mine who's getting me information on that. But when she talked about the Khmer Rouge soldier, she was distressed. But when she said to me and grabbed my arm with Angkar, the eyes that she had remain with me. And I know her experience of using the word Angkar was different than her using the word Khmer Rouge, just in my own heuristic experience. But yes, there's something much more where Angkar can possess. The Khmer Rouge didn't possess. A lot of people believe that when the Khmer Rouge did awful things, now these are people from more of the remote regions, when the Khmer Rouge did awful things, it's because Angkar was in their body, having them do awful things. See, so it's this possessing force. Very, very different meaning. Yeah. So thanks for that question, Nancy. Yes.
Hi.
I notice you have a.
Hi, I am a Khmer Rouge survivor. So,
Yes.
The word Angkar itself, and when I was growing up there, it's a fear. Is it bad? Nothing come out good from that. And as a kid, no, be careful. The Angkar listen to you. So is that, what happened is that at night, and you're sleeping with relatives, you don't talk because they found out that some people will in the morning pull away and be.
There was nobody to trust, right?
So the fear of the Ongai mystery is everywhere. The old saying that the Khmer Rouge said the Ongais have the eye of the pineapple.
That's right, eyes of the pineapple. It looks in every direction. That's right, yeah,
Right.
yeah.
And, so that Ongai. My question to you is, I went to Killing Field recently.
Yes.
And the bracelet that you wear.
Yes.
And I saw them, a lot of them over there now. And I'm wondering, is that the tourist saying that to those?
Yes.
We heard the story. We know what you went through, or is it the emotional?
No, I mean, there's a lot of tourism around rituals right now in Cambodia about people getting, strings and not really going through the long, very Buddhist, that's why I use the word sequence. Most tourists are told that this is for good luck. They really wouldn't know that it's really about keeping the souls in. But again, the ritual that one has to go through in order to get that, and the cutting of the strings is very different. So they sell the strings. That's different than being in the ceremony where the string is strung and strung and strung, and then it's cut, and you're in the ceremony for that. But yeah. So I mean, I haven't been to the killing fields in a while, so I don't know how.
I did my second time. The first time I did not see a lot of that of the bracelet, but now
Right.
it's like all
Yeah, I
place.
think yeah.
And my interpretation probably like, that I heard the story. You went through this horrible, murder, and try to connect it emotionally.
Right.
But the bone is still there. They kind of put like, watch out the bone. So you look there, it's bone all over the place, and then chicken.
Yeah. It's. What was that like for you?
Pretty sad.
Yes, I bet.
So I think 1982, I went to another one called the one in Phnom Penh. So
Yes.
Chiang Mai, this one
Yes.
far away from the city.
Yes.
But the one that I went there, at pretty fresh when I went up there, you kind of smell the fresh, the horror. And I told myself, just a kid, I never want to go back to this place. And so probably 4 years ago, I took my friend there, and I told him I'm not going in there. I take you there, but I'm not going to go in there. And I still feel that horror.
Was that in Battambang? Where was that?
No, actually it's in Phnom Penh.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay. There are a lot of killing caves and yeah.
The torture.
Oh, the S21 prison. Yes.
So, my name is Mariko,
Yes.
and this is Michi, and
Yes.
we are the executive director and clinical director, and we provide mental health services for Cambodians in Long Beach.
Mm-hmm.
And some of this stuff really resonated because we had a grant where we can use spiritual Buddhist blessing ceremonies as part of the actual mental health treatment of our clients.
Mm.
And they are healed by that process. The whole concept of spirituality in the Cambodians, as far as I know, it's like in everything. It's in every action that you do. It's, every ritual, whether it's water, a flower, a candle, it's all related. And then the whole concept of karma and the guilt, what we would call in Western society, guilt that not just that you survived, but in a way, what did you do in a prior life that may have created this situation? And so the fact that we can provide these ceremonies for our clients is very powerful because a lot of them are very poor and they could never afford such a ceremony. So we've been very blessed. Our staff, we have 8 Cambodian staff members, and one of them is an Ajahn. And so because of his relationship, and he was a monk, we have very good relationships with a lot of the ones.
Yeah.
And it's been a whole process of learning for those of us who are not Cambodian.
Right.
But we're very connected to the Long Beach
Yeah.
Cambodian community in many ways. It's a very, despite what they have gone through, there is, I feel, in the Long Beach, if you take the Cambodian community as a whole, there's a lot of resilience too. These are people who have gone through a lot and who have survived, and many of them are doing well despite the trauma.
Right. Yeah, it's just the spirit, that spirit-based anxiety can be awakened. Yeah.
It's very wonderful that we're allowed to do that.
Also, you were depicting a lot. What we do is we rotate at different lots in Long Beach. So we have these blessing ceremonies in different areas of Long Beach so that we can have it accessible to the community.
And then we just added cooking classes, which are done at the temples, because then the clients, their family members can cook, teach about the Cambodian cooking, which many of them have lost due to Khmer Rouge. But also they can give food to the monks, which is part of their tradition to give back. So it just resonates in so many areas.
Yep.
And again, it's always, paying back, helping others. And in a sense, it's part of what we in Western society call empowerment. They're empowered by giving. And it's really beautiful to see that.
Thank you. Yes.
Hi, my name is Jolie.
Yeah.
I think my question is more for you guys than it is for you. But I think you work with my aunt, Julie. And so,
Julie did?
Yeah. So
I do.
I was wondering, in terms of what you're saying in response to this presentation and how you guys have used rituals and spiritual ceremonies, Buddhist ceremonies, to treat people who continue to experience PTSD as a result of the Khmer Rouge regime, and the war that was happening beyond that before the regime took power. I was wondering how much, how much more of these spiritual ceremonies you use as opposed to the prescription of psychotropic medication and drugs to treat patients' mental health issues?
Well, I think it depends on the client, and we are very respectful of what the client wishes. But there are some clients who come who, it's not so much trauma as it is, a mental illness. And so there might be needs for psychotropic medication. There are others that it's more trauma focused. So some of these other things, social isolation is a big factor in some of the depression. So we work to create situations.
So, and I'd like to direct you, there's a colleague of mine who's in Cambodia, and I can give you the information. In Cambodia, they don't use the word depression, or they don't use our nomenclature, but the equivalent of PTSD is called Bok Sabat. And a colleague of mine who's a Cambodian psychiatrist, he developed a criteria for that actually includes a lot of the material that I've spoken about as part of that. And in his writing, he talks about, again, that when I talk about sequencing, to be really careful that we're not just combining different sort of Western sort of healing techniques with Cambodian healing techniques. I mean, I'm trying to say this very, very carefully, because sometimes people will incorporate meditation, but it's more a Western-based meditation. In Cambodia, there's not that kind of meditation that people would do in meditation centers here, or yoga. They wouldn't do yoga like people would do in a yoga center here. So what we're finding is, in some of the research we're doing in Cambodia and looking at what healing things are happening outside of Cambodia, is that people are starting to create these potpourris of methods. And there can be something very powerful and helpful in that, but there can also be something that maybe has a little edge of that ritual side that I was talking about, where we substitute one ritual for another. So it's just to be really careful about, what sequencing there is with different so-called healing methods. And there's a testimonial therapy also in Cambodia that's being done. It was based on some of the work being done in South America. And in that testimonial healing, people actually will say their testimony to a witness, and that witness writes it all down, and then they take that to a monk. And then in front of a monk, the witness says out loud what that history was, and then the monk does 3 different sequential, it's very important, the sequence, 3 different ceremonies for that person. And we're finding that that's having quite people are symptoms of not sleeping, or such as my colleague's brother-in-law in that film, of having those repeated dreams are being supported a bit more. So I just wanted to say that in terms of caution. So,
But I want to take exception. I mean, first of all, we're not imposing religious or spiritual practices on our Cambodian clients. These are organically evolved from the Cambodian clients.
I hear that. That's why I said I was trying to be careful in the way I framed that. Okay. Okay.
Secondly, I really agree with the testimonial because we just did a 3-day symposium with Dr. Malika.
Yes, I was there.
Yeah. Oh, you were there? Oh,
Yes, I was there.
did I see
I know Malika's work from a long time ago in the
so,
90s.
You know, we also find that that's also very powerful.
Right, right.
You know, there's so many ways to heal people.
Right, okay.
I'd
All right.
like to also say that you were talking about meditation. We also offer meditation.
Right.
But
Okay.
it's taught by a monk.
Right.
It's not taught by some
It's not a
Westerner
it's not a
who's coming in
Western
and saying, this is how you do
meditation.
mindful meditation. And it's done in Khmer, by the way.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, it
Yes.
seems to me that the Khmer Rouge using that combination of bath, right, break you down.
Yes,
and
break you down.
also the
Yep.
bad karma from previous
Yep.
life.
Yep.
So when you carry it with you, like, why should I receive the Khmer Rouge? It's my time to die, to let them kill me. And then Khmer Rouge took that advantage and the fullness. So if you somehow, overcome that as people surviving here, to get away from all this past, there's nothing, you did not do anything wrong. Forget about the previous past, here you are and be empowered by that, and that probably helping them. At least help for me, I can survive. But I cannot compare for me to, let's say, my parents, because I was too young to understand at that time. So the bad thing that happened to me as not to my dad, who understood more than I did.
Right. But those.
And there were also ways in which, my parents came from Cambodia, right? And they were part of this era where people were being, quote unquote, arranged to be married together, right? There were ways in which people subverted those practices.
Absolutely, and they
their own marriages to
right.
avoid
A lot of people went to the Khmer Rouge.
That's not going to be
Yep.
documented because
Yep.
why are people going to talk about it?
That's right. That's right. I agree with you. And there are a lot of people that actually went to the Khmer Rouge and asked to marry a certain person, and they arranged that for them. Yeah, there's many, many different ways it happened. Thank you for that comment.
One of my distant relatives, somehow, this is in Battambang. This is when the Vietnamese invaded and when we escaped from Posad to Battambang. And we met a couple, one is my distant relative, and he's really smart before the Khmer Rouge. He won, achieved a good score. And when we met, my dad met, and he's like walking his head down, and he's arranging with the Khmer Rouge marriage. His wife came over and talked to my dad, said, Uncle, I am going to Phnom Penh, I'm going to leave him because he have a mental issue. And then my dad said, no, he's not mental, this is a super smart person before the Khmer. So what happened though? He pretended to be mental issue. And then he couldn't get back from after the Khmer Rouge or being kicked out by Vietnamese. So then my dad said, no, you don't leave him. And he's this really smart guy. So she stayed with him. And now they have 3 kids.
Right. Has 6 children, by the way, in my tape. Yeah. So, any other comments? I'm realizing it's sort of getting late. So yes, go ahead, and I'll stay here.
It's about an aside.
Okay.
But that you made during the presentation. But prior to that, I also want to say thank you for a very careful and detailed talk. You mentioned that one potential reason why maybe the Khmer Rouge ultimately wasn't as successful was because they didn't completely overturn some of these
one of my hypotheses.
Hypotheses, and I was wondering if there was any sort of more detailed study that hypothesizes that has to take place in order for there to be a sort of consolidated regime change.
I think the Papa Doc is a good one. That's the only one I could find in my,
Maybe of the Cultural Revolution in China, where it seemed to be a little more thorough. I don't know, at least.
Yeah, but they still didn't target some of those sort of mediums and others. Actually, Pol Pot, Salazar, took his design from the Cultural Revolution in China. He went there and visited. He didn't go back to see when it, see what fell apart. But that was how he originally designed what he designed.
Right. But maybe then I'm also just curious.
It's a great question.
Within the Pol Pot's regime, there was any kind of, for lack of a better term, strategic negotiation about the importance of thoroughly overturning these issues? Because it seems like, again, I really like the presentation. I don't want to cast aspersions anyway, but that term ritualcide, I thought really meant the thorough destruction, and in some sense they kind of adapted these
alteration,
or alteration,
right?
Right.
Yeah.
Rather than completely doing away with them.
Right.
So
Right.
again, I thought it was really interesting.
Right. Well, thank you. Yeah, I mapped that, but again, I was going to say one thing about that. Yeah. Again, because of people telling me where they would sneak to get those resources, let me know that, and even when they started creating those communes with the huts and all of that, then those little communes had their own little secret medium and fortune teller and so on. So yeah, people started bringing those because they didn't have to be derobed, they were just sort of word of mouth resources. Yeah.
But it's very difficult to kill culture and tradition, and I think every time that they've tried to do that, when you think of China or Cambodia or any country, it ultimately fails, I think, because of just the strength of the tradition and people, and because people live with hope and recovery, and wanting to, have more joy in their life, and these kind of dictatorships or genocides or whatever you want to call them don't offer that. So ultimately they fail. It may take decades, but they fail.
Well, I'm interested in the ongoing fallout that's still happening. So I'm going to bring this to a close. I'll hang around in the front if people want to ask me personal questions. And I thank you so much for your attention. There's a lot to attend to.